Yikes! It's Mr. Thompson with a science video lesson. Continuing on about evolution and specifically natural selection and speciation. Kind of a big deal. This is like really what evolution is all about. This is the crux of evolution, how it works and what it is. No little table of contents here, but there is one down below, so let's get started. Okay, so first of all, natural selection, what is it? Okay, this whole page is going to be about natural selection, and there's three sort of key terms that you need to understand in order to grasp natural selection. So they are variation, competition, and then selection. Okay, there's going to be a bunch of notes about each of those, so you might want to leave space or just wait until I'm done here to write this all down if that's what you're doing. But probably you have a general gist of what these words mean. Okay, we just need to define them in the context of evolution. So last video was all about variation, all about the differences between species and within species. Okay, and the key here for natural selection is that those differences are going to either help or harm the survival. And that will come to play in all of these terms. But basically, if a variation helps a species or an individual survive, then that's going to give it an advantage, and it's going to make it more likely to pass on its genes, which is the really big deal, okay? Which we'll come back to. Competition can be between individuals in a species or between species, and it's all about the competition to survive, right? So life or death, and really what we're doing, we're competing for resources or for life itself. Right, so there might be a certain amount of a certain kind of food, and so two different species are competing to, be able to eat as much of that food as they can and as much as they need. And so if one individual, one species eats all the food, then there's less for the other species, obviously. Sometimes an animal can be the food. So, there's predator and prey. So the struggle to survive for the prey is obviously to try to keep from being eaten long enough to pass on your genes, right? Selection, when we talk about selection, we're really talking about selection pressures. Well, there's selection and selection pressures. And selection pressures are these environmental factors that determine which variations are advantageous. So in one environment, a species or an organism may have a certain variation that is helpful, while that same variation in a different environment would not be helpful, would be harmful, right? Again, what we're aiming for is passing on our genes. Evolutionarily speaking, the success is measured by being able to pass on your genes. Okay, so being able to procreate, have children or whatever, the next generation, that kind of thing, because then that ensures the survival of your species. Right, that's what's sort of the goal, as you might say. Okay, so the variations give advantages or disadvantages in this competition, and the selection pressures determine the advantages or disadvantages, and then the fittest, right, you might say, the organisms with the most advantages are able to most easily pass on their genes and to reproduce. All right, so that's the method of natural selection. It's all about natural forces, so the environmental forces. There's nothing sort of pulling the strings and directing traffic. It's the environment, and it's just whatever happens will happen, right? Now, speciation is when there is a change in a species, and it basically, there's so many variations that happen, so many changes that happen over time, that a new species is formed. And this is determined, this is sort of defined by the inability for an organism to interbreed. So if you had, say one organism turns into another, if that new organism tried to breed with the old one, they would either not be able to breed at all, they wouldn't be able to have any offspring, or that offspring would not be able to reproduce itself. So if that offspring of those two organisms can't breed, if it can't reproduce, then it's not really, it's not a species, it's a sort of a combination of two other species, which isn't really a thing. I mean, it is a thing, but it's not a species in and of itself. Okay, so that's the definition of speciation, of a new species being created. Now, this happens in a variety of ways, and I'm going to outline a few here. So phyletic evolution is just a gradual change over time. One species just changes a little bit and a little bit and a little bit by generation after generation, and it changes gradually from one into another. Okay, it turns into another species completely. So that would be the original species that it started off as would be like gone, right? It wouldn't exist anymore because the entire population changed into another one. Okay. A more common type of evolution is divergent, or you might say branching. It's also known as branching evolution, where one species is divided into groups, and there's lots of different ways that species can be divided. Most commonly it's geographic, so one group moves off this way, the other group moves off another way, and they evolve separately until they become different species and can no longer interbreed. Okay? Divergent or branching. Then there's convergent evolution is another thing that can happen, where two different species, which were different to begin with, evolve separately, but similarly. Okay, maybe they're in very similar environments, maybe they're in the same environment, and they have very similar selection pressures, and then they the result of their evolution at the same time ends up with similar features, right? Next is coevolution. All right, coevolution is when the evolution of one species influences the evolution of another species. Okay, and the easiest sort of illustration or example of this is when a host animal or organism evolves, and if that host has a parasite, another organism that sort of depends on and feeds on that host, the host evolving can cause the parasite to evolve as well. Okay. Extinction is an important part of evolution. Extinction, probably most folks know what it is, when a species no longer exists on Earth. Okay, so when all have died out, they haven't been able to pass on their genes. This is important because it can influence the evolution of other species as well. It's kind of coevolution, except one species is not evolving. So if there was a parasite host or something like that, and the host becomes extinct, then the parasite would have to evolve and find another host, or else it will go extinct as well. Okay, lots of examples of that kind of thing. Last bit for today, for now, is analogous structures. And this just kind of fits in with these kind of topics. It's not a different kind of evolution, but basically when two different species, similar to coevolution and convergent evolution, when two different species develop attributes, when different species develop similar attributes due to similar environmental pressures, selection pressures and stuff like that. So there can be things where you look at one organism and you look at another and you go, oh, this is really similar. Maybe one evolved from another, but then it turns out no, they didn't. One didn't evolve from another. They both evolved separately, but similarly, because they were under similar environmental selection pressures and so on and so forth. All right, lots of notes. There are lots and lots of different examples of each of these. I would encourage you, if you want to find examples of these, is do a bit of your own research and reading. You can just Google all these things and type examples of such and such, and you'll come up with all kinds of different examples. I encourage you to dive into these kinds of things in that way. That's it for now. Catch you later.